I'm Glenn Powell, welcoming you to the Texas Tribune Festival. Every year this weekend is about big ideas about the future of our state and our country. In case this is your first rodeo, you're going to hear things and meet people you don't agree with. And that's the point. At TribFest, the rules are we listen to each other. We treat each other with respect despite our differences, so be kind, be courteous, and most of all, be civil. And if you can't be civil, well, I happen to know a hitman.
All right, everybody, I think we're going to get started. Can you all hear me? Okay. So, my name is Lormi Creel. I'm a reporter with ProPublica and the Texas Tribune, and I'm really grateful that you all are here with us at TribFest today. For the past 2 years, I've covered the Uvalde school shooting along with my colleagues, and unfortunately, this is the third mass shooting I've covered in Texas. This year also marks more than 25 years after the Columbine High School massacre in Colorado. And the statistics are unfortunately really sobering. Since then, there have been at least 416 school shootings, according to the Washington Post. But if you use the definition put forth by the Violence Prevention Project, which classifies a mass shooting as involving at least 4 deaths, not including the gunman, there have been at least 193 mass shootings. Neither is great. And this week, as we were actually preparing with our panelists to discuss how to break the cycle on mass shootings, there was, as you guys all know, another one in an Atlanta suburb. The 14-year-old boy who is accused in that shooting is one of the youngest mass school shooters ever. He killed 2 students and 2 teachers and injured 9 people. So far, we know a few things about him. He was investigated last year in connection with a school shooting threat, but authorities at the time could not link him definitively to it. His family had previous contacts with social services. His parents divorced. He was bullied at school. His father told law enforcement that he had access to his hunting rifles, but not that it was supervised access, but it's later emerged that he actually bought him a rifle after the fact and gave it to him as a gift. And so the father has now also been charged with various counts, including manslaughter and murder. There's some similarities between the Atlanta shooting and Uvalde in the sense that it seems that both of the gunmen, the teenage gunmen, had some sort of mental health issues. But in other ways, unfortunately, Uvalde, which is kind of what brings us all here today, was very, very different. One of the biggest failures, the worst school shooting in Texas, the worst in the country after Sandy Hook. Failures on all accounts, from mental health, access to guns. The gunman bought an assault-style rifle on the day he turned 18. And then also school security issues. A lot of the doors didn't lock. And then, of course, in the 2 years since, the lack of accountability for nearly 400 law enforcement officers who responded and waited 77 minutes to confront the gunman. So that's what brings us together here, unfortunately, to discuss. We have 4 very esteemed panelists to help us unpack this. Representative Joe Moody is from El Paso, a Democrat, and rushed to the scene of the Walmart shooting there in 2019. He also was appointed to the House committee investigating the Uvalde response that came out with, at the time, was the most extensive report on what had happened there. Jesse Rizzo is the uncle to Jackie Cazares, who died at Robb Elementary School in 2022. He was also elected to the Uvalde School Board last year. Jacqueline Schildkraut has been studying mass shootings for 17 years. She's executive director of the Regional Gun Violence Research Consortium at the Rockefeller Institute of Government in New York. And then A.J. DeAndrea, who was one of the SWAT team officers who responded to Columbine. He is a former deputy police chief in Colorado, retired last year, is that correct? And he teaches active shooter training across the country and internationally, including he just went to Serbia last year for their first ever school shooting, mass shooting, school shooting, yeah. So we have a lot to discuss. Everybody brings a very different perspective. Representative Moody, I'm going to start with you to talk to us a little bit about the committee that you were appointed to after Uvalde. It produced the most extensive account at the time of what occurred. There have been other reports since then. But what was the mandate of that committee? How is it different to previous commissions or reports after other mass shootings in Texas? And what do you think, what questions did that report, does it still leave unanswered today?
Sure, and I appreciate the opportunity to have this discussion. It's an important discussion to continue to have. And much like the commitment I made to the families in El Paso over 5 years ago, I made that same commitment to the families in Uvalde when I left there, and that is to never stop looking for solutions so that this doesn't happen again. The investigatory committee was very different. In the past, I was involved in looking at legislative solutions post Santa Fe, where we looked at red flag laws, where we looked at access, if an adult is giving access to a readily dischargeable firearm to a minor. I was involved in the Committee on Public Safety after the El Paso and Midland Odessa shootings. So we looked at legislative solutions in the wake of those tragedies. This one was very different in that we were not tasked with looking for legislative solutions, but ultimately to lay the facts bare. If you recall, in the hours and the days following Uvalde, there was an incredible amount of misinformation. Some of it was coming directly from state officials. There was a lot of confusion about what did or didn't happen. People were producing unvetted facts, and the community, and I know this firsthand, the community cannot begin to heal or begin to move forward if they don't understand what happened, if they don't have the basic facts of what went on. And so our committee stepped into a space of confusion and disinformation, and our job and our mandate was set the record straight to the best of your ability. What happened? What were the failures? And what were the points from A to Z from this the attacker accessing weapons, to what happened with school security, to what happened with law enforcement response, what happened with the information post the tragedy. And so our job was to lay the facts bare. These are the facts. And then the tool itself, the report, was then supposed to lend itself to a conversation about what can we do. It was not a committee built to come up with legislative solutions. It was a committee built to produce facts. It is one of the most difficult jobs, actually it is the most difficult job I have ever been asked to do. But the most difficult work in the legislature is always the work worth doing. And it's something that I never wanted to be a part of, but I think it is something that was very important to be a part of, because there are many, many lessons that we can learn and a lot of places we can go based on the information that we provided in that report.
We're going to come back to some of those legislative changes that were made or failed to make in a little bit. But Jesse, I wanted to turn to you. Your niece, Jackie, died at Robb. She was one of at least 3 victims who still had a pulse when she was rescued 77 minutes later. And it remains unknown today, right, whether she or others could have survived. The district attorney ended a investigation into a survivability study, essentially, that the Texas Rangers had asked the Austin medical examiner to do. And so we don't know that today, and it's possible she may have conducted this investigation separately with the grand jury, but we just don't know. So can you tell us what has the past 2 years been like for your family grappling with this?
It's been horrible, but first of all, I'm honored, and humbled to be here. And as I prepared for today's panel, I thought about it's a 60-minute conversation that we're going to have. And I thought about the ordeal, the hell that these children lived through. 77 minutes, which is obviously more than the 60 minutes that we're going to sit here. So I'd like for everybody at the end to think about what they lived through as we sit here under a tent and what torture they may have suffered. And to answer your question, you know, with the district attorney stopping the investigation and saying, you know, she lived 5 minutes, 4 minutes, 60 minutes, it's a thing that we'll never know. It's an unanswered question. It will never bring peace. And someone with such a high responsibility to basically shut that door on the families, on the parents, on my niece, you know, it'll never bring that type of peace or begin to have the closure. So it's very difficult, you know, and that I don't just speak for my niece, you know, I think about the other children and what they have been able, or what if they have been able to survive. If somebody would have just breached and tried the door that day. But it was just unacceptable.
And what is your assessment 2 years later about the investigation and the state's handling of the response?
Ineptitude. I think that such a great state, so many resources, but such a big failure. It's just you can't comprehend the magnitude of that. And it's like one obstacle after another, and then information gets leaked out. You know, they try to hold back on things, knowing that eventually it's going to come out. We're forever grateful for Mr. Moody and the work that he did, because that validated what we had assumed and thought throughout the time, right? And it comes out, and that information is published, and it brings a little bit of vindication for us. But even to this day, you know, just living in Uvalde is very difficult to do. It's very challenging. But it's failure at all levels. You know, you have your DPS, Mr. McGraw, that tells you that he's going to resign, basically quit if there's some type of failure. The failure is obvious, but he finds a way around the situation to continue on, and he gets to enjoy the rest of his life, the retirement benefits, and so on and so forth. You know, only 2 people were indicted out of almost 400. That's an army of people that had responsibility that day, and only 2 people get indicted. It's hard to live with, you know, as a family member, as a community member, as an uncle. It's very difficult.
AJ, you responded to Columbine that kind of really changed how we think about how police should respond to mass shootings. And you faced, speaking of criticism, your team faced a lot of criticism at that time. Can you talk a little bit about kind of how the training has evolved since then, the best practices, and how Uvalde differed from that kind of 25 years later based on what you know?
Sure. Well, first, I just want to say it's an honor to be here to spend a little bit of time. And again, so sorry for your loss. In 2024, our citizens, I think, deserve better, right, than what we saw that day. And so if we go back 25 years ago, we look at Columbine, right, became the watershed moment of law enforcement response to these instances. It wasn't the first by any means, we know that. Many happened prior. But tactics back then, as we know, is they would set a perimeter, they'd wait for the SWAT team to get there, the SWAT team went in, and so in an active shooting, as all of you know, right, we can't do that. That we have to get to work, we have to get to work faster. And so post-Columbine, we see where we started to train patrol officers how to get into the building, how to address this threat, right? We talk about in law enforcement that we do what is actionable. It's the information that is coming in, moment in time, what is actionable, and that's where we should be putting our efforts. So when we look at Uvalde, we have this response. And there's gunfire in the room, and typically we talk about we need to get to the threat. Now, I think a misnomer that the public has, and this comes from pundits, it comes from people that maybe don't understand the full dilemma, is you don't actually have to run in the room to end the solution, to solve the problem, but you need to solve the problem. whether that's some type of divided attention, fighting from a threshold, taking a window, as we heard the Bortak guys when they first got there, they said, hey, we can go from the window. These are all things that should have been thought about years ago. And the failure of that response is truly at the executive level in law enforcement that has got one solution to the dilemma after it kicks off, and that's run through the door on a guy that's shooting back at you. And so that's kind of the overarching failure, is not understanding the dilemma and having options to be able to address it quickly. With that said, we also have other actionable information that should have been acted on. And I wasn't there, and I'm not going to be a critic of what those guys did. There's no one that's been more criticized in this room than me at the Columbine response, right, as we were learning and trying to move forward. The thing is, we learned, though, and we pushed forward. But we talk about standard responses. You know, it's a standard across this country that we have rescue task force capabilities. That if someone is bleeding, maybe we can't even get to the gunman. Maybe that dilemma is being dealt with, but we still should be coming in actionable information, or we have people that are injured. We backfill then with rescue task force, which is, you know, bringing firefighters to the victims, getting them out, trying to get them to an emergency room to try and save lives. So there's three things we concentrate on, right? Stop the killing, stop the dying, start the healing. Those are those three things, and those should be happening at the same time. And so we saw this failure point of really, you know, had one solution, and that was run through the door. And when that started to fail, they had nothing else that they had thought about. And so when you talk about standards now in the country, that's where we're at, right? We have stop the killing, stop the dying, start the healing, and we're doing that all at the same time. And if the leaders aren't visionary, if the leaders aren't thinking this thing through, then we have failure, right? And so I think that's what we should be expecting in 2024 after it kicks off. Now, there's things we can do to prevent it at the beginning, right? But once it kicks off, you know, for law enforcement, they should have those three capabilities. Those are things that they should be thinking about. Again, it is what is actionable. Not what I'm assuming, but what is actionable moment in time. And it was just it just stalled. And in 2024, like I said, our citizens deserve better. We learned from Columbine. And I'll close with this and we can move on, but I think one of the other problems is, and we live this over and over and over again, is we have an attitude, whether it's law enforcement or whether it's the community. And this is where everybody needs to be a little bit more introspective with themselves. But there's an attitude of, it's not going to happen here. It's not going to happen here. And so law enforcement will train, but in it's not going to happen here. Not my community, not my school. Schools will say, not my kids. It's not going to happen here. And so when it does kick off, we're already set way behind the eight ball.
Yeah, we're going to follow up on some of the training changes that have been made. But Jacqueline, speaking of it's not going to happen here, you have lived in Parkland and Orlando and studied, obviously, mass shootings for 17 years. So can you tell us a little bit about what you have learned from these communities in your research and how Uvalde is different and how we kind of put those lessons going forward?
Yes, and thank you as well. It's an honor to be among these panelists and being able to have this conversation with all of you. And my thoughts go to you as well as your community for all of your losses. You know, our community was just as guilty as saying it could never happen here. 3 weeks before the shooting happened, we were voted one of the safest communities in America.
This is Parkland?
Parkland, yes. And then we weren't, you know, and we have become a nation that's somewhat desensitized in a sense because we're so inundated with mass shootings, and they are horrific events. They don't impact one family. They impact everybody in a community. But when we're thinking about gun violence, we also don't talk about it in context, which is to say this is a very rare form of gun violence. It is absolutely horrific. It is incredibly rare. But just because something is rare doesn't mean, to AJ's point, that we don't prepare for it, right? We do know several things about mass shootings. We do know that even in their rarest capacity, they are still increasing in frequency year over year. And they have been very steadily since 1966, right down the street at the University of Texas at Austin on the Tower. We know that over time they have become more lethal. We also know that there are myths that are being perpetuated out there that aren't always the case. So, we do know things that such that those events that are perpetrated using assault-style rifles, your AR-15s, your AK-47s, those are in fact more lethal than those that involve handguns. But handguns are used 3 to 1 in mass shootings than assault-style rifles. So it's not to say that one is worse or better than the other, but that we have to have a comprehensive conversation about how we prevent mass shootings. One thing that I also think is really important, and we hear this a lot, pundits, sorry, little media, is about what mass shooters look like, right? And that there is this profile, and we can go out and figure out what they look like. And other than them being, sorry, gentlemen up here, other than them being men, 95 to 96% of the time, and them all using firearms, there's a lot of variability in them, in between the types of locations that they're choosing, in between the communities that they are attacking, in between their own socio-demographic backgrounds. And so I think we have to stop fixating on what we think mass shooters look like and start focusing on what we know that they do have in common, which is what they're doing before they ever enter the location. And that is they are engaging in the same sets of pre-attack behaviors and pre-attack communications time and time again. And those are really the opportunities. I know we all look a lot at response and how are we going to fix the response moving forward, but AJ said this as well, right? We want to prevent it before we ever have to worry about responding. And where we do that is looking at the things that we know are commonalities and how we use those to our advantages as communities to prevent the next tragedy from happening.
Jacqueline, who is supposed to do that? Because, in the case of Uvalde, the teenage shooter had a lot of red flags. He was absent for more than 100 days in one school year, yet Representative Moody's report found that it doesn't appear any school district official ever checked up on him. He then dropped out. He was active on social media. He had been bullied. He had a troubled family life. It seems the same way with the Georgia teenager who was supposedly bullied and had apparently been asking for mental help and didn't get it. So who is supposed to do this?
I think that's a good question, and if I may, before I answer that, I want to be really cautious with the bullying comment, because we know that there are so many youth out there who are bullied and don't pick up a firearm against other people. Some do engage in self-harm with firearms or other methodologies, but when we continuously pinpoint bullying as a cause for mass shootings, we are over-predicting and criminalizing largely nonviolent people who are actually having violence perpetrated against them. So I think we can say that it is possibly a correlate, but can we say it is a cause? No, because then we would be saying that it's kind of like the argument about violent video games, right? You would have to then turn around and criminalize every single person who has ever played Grand Theft Auto. And you can't do that because most of them didn't go out and do the same thing. What I think is we have a systemic failure. It's not one person's responsibility to go out and put all the pieces together, right? We know that when we look at something like behavioral threat assessment, it is a multidisciplinary process. It involves our law enforcement partners and our courts, which is criminal justice, but it involves our schools. It involves our places of worship. It involves families, behavioral mental health in the community. And so it's really about breaking down the silos that exist in every community to this day where there is just a lack of information sharing. We saw it in Uvalde, we saw it in Parkland, we saw it in Columbine, in Sandy Hook, and everywhere else. Everybody has a piece of the puzzle, but it's about thinking, how do we put those pieces together? And I think, honestly, unfortunately, that also comes to us as citizens, because a lot of times we hear information, and whether we are desensitized to it, whether we think, oh, okay, a lot of stuff about gun violence is very ingrained in our vernacular, right? We talk about, I'll shoot you an email, or we do things with bullet points, right? These are language choices that we just kind of pass off and don't think about because they're just who we are. And so sometimes we hear it from other people and we're like, oh, they're just saying something in this way. But one of the things that we know about mass shooters is they are so consumed with what they are planning that they will literally tell anybody who will listen what they are planning to do. Before that individual walked into Robb Elementary School, he was online telling somebody, I just shot my grandmother and I'm going to go do this. And that was likely not the first time he had said something to somebody. And so, it's about breaking down the bystander effect that we are all guilty of. And not just in this instance of preventing mass violence, but of helping people in general. We have to break down the bystander effect and turn it into a culture, change the culture from snitching to helping. How do we get people who are in crisis resources they need, whatever that crisis is and whatever those resources look like? So I think it's on all of us.
Representative.
Thank you.
Thank you. Representative Moody, on that point, mental health is often blamed after mass shootings, but there was a 2022 Houston Chronicle investigation that found none of the Texas school districts had the professionally recommended student to provider ratios in the state. So essentially, students were not getting all the help that they needed. What changes were made after Uvalde when it comes to mental health, and what has not been made? What more needs to be done?
I think the phrase that I heard right now is something that I want to zero in on, because it is what we led with when we produced this report in Uvalde, which was multiple systemic failures. That was the takeaway we wanted people to understand. This was not one thing or another. It wasn't just because the doors didn't lock properly. It wasn't just because law enforcement responded inappropriately. It wasn't just because there were red flags that were not identified and acted upon. It wasn't just because we have allowed for access to firearms, these firearms, for certain individuals. It was all of those things combined that led to this tragedy. And if any one of them had been disrupted in any way, shape, or form, you could have prevented a tragedy like this. I will go back to, and I'm going to talk about the mental health stuff, but I will go back to the core element. If we had a law that Representative King tried to pass in this last session that said this individual could not access this firearm until he was 21, this would not have happened, period, end of sentence. I have had this conversation with many people, and they say, well, you don't know. And they have this idea that, like, well, you can write whatever laws you want to write, but criminals, they don't follow the laws. Well, criminals don't live in a world that is different from yours and mine. They live in the same world that we do. In fact, he had been trying to access weapons up until that point. And guess what? He couldn't. The law was working. The problem was the law wasn't strong enough. When that impediment was lifted, he had access to that firearm. 3 more years on that, and I guarantee you the red flags would have been picked up on. There would have been more opportunities to figure out how to navigate this person away from that violence that he was on track to commit. There were ways to do that. Part of that is what are the services we're providing in our schools? The big roadblock we've run into in the conversation in that building down the road is, well, we don't want, parents have certain rights. We don't want to intervene and make sure that we don't want certain things being done with our kids that the parents don't know what's happening and they're not involved. And I get it. And parents, I'm a parent of 3 young kids. I would like to know what's going on with my kids too. But they need to have access to those services, and we need to inform parents the best we can and weave them into the solution process. But in a case like this, there is no family structure. There's no family structure for the attacker in this case. The one person that was trying to help him was the first person he shot that day. So there was no family structure. So yes, there are things we need to put in place in the schools, but this is one of those instances where I say Robb Elementary could have had an enormous amount of resources, but that kid was a ghost come the time of the shooting. He was absent, and they washed their hands of him. I still have never understood the lack of follow-up when he was presenting with so many problems. So we do need to have the resources available for interventions, particularly because, as was stated, these things are talked about. This is a person that was called school shooter by people that he interacted with in social media. So this wasn't something that, to Jack's point, like, this wasn't something that came up that day. This is something that was months in the making and that could have been curtailed, but you have to have those pieces in place. And the school is a good place to do that, because you're going to have consistent interaction with the kids, and in a good environment, you're having consistent interaction with parents or family members that are involved with them.
You mentioned raise the age that Representative King tried to pass, and it didn't go anywhere last session. What are the chances of any movement on that next session?
I don't know. I think it's a very difficult thing to legislate around access to firearms. In the very same session, we had a bill to lower the age to purchase handguns. And so it is a very difficult space to work in.
Why is it so difficult in Texas? I mean, we've seen that in other states, Colorado, AJ, you can talk about that. They have passed gun restrictions after mass shootings. In Florida, Nevada, Colorado, Republican-led states passed red flag bills, raise the age. Why is it difficult in Texas?
I cannot, I have thought about this over and over and have been asked this over and over. I cannot understand the unwillingness to get involved in common sense reforms around access. You can be pro Second Amendment and still legislate in this space. The Supreme Court has said so. They've given you 3 ways you can do that. You can talk about what kind of weapons you have access to, where you can have those weapons, right? Location restrictions, and then who can access. The first 2 that I mentioned are non-starters in that building. What kind of weapons and location. Location restrictions don't exist essentially in this state. So let's talk about, because there is some agreement about who should have access. Convicted felons that have been involved in human trafficking or sexual assault, aggravated sexual assault, child trafficking. There are people on the books today. We have restrictions to access to firearms now in Texas. So philosophically, we've agreed that there are certain circumstances that we don't want people to have access to firearms. So let's continue to have the conversation in that space. Who else fits in that category? Maybe it is a situation like this. But let's keep having that conversation, because the other 2 seem to, the door has been closed on. And there seems to, at least when we talk to legislators on both sides of the aisle, they go, well, yeah, there's certain people that shouldn't have access. Okay, well, tell me who. Tell me who, because we have laws that say domestic abusers, right? We have restrictions in our law today. So let's go one step further. Are there ways that we can expand that to unsafe people, even if temporarily, to divest them of access to firearms for their safety and for the safety of those around them? I think it's a worthwhile conversation. I don't understand the resistance to it. I've never understood it. And we just have to keep pushing and talking about it, because eventually, and sadly, this is going to visit more communities until we roll up our sleeves and have that difficult conversation.
AJ, you have, I think, a slightly different perspective on gun restrictions, although your state passed a red flag law and raised the age, although that's being upheld now by a federal court. What gun restrictions would you be willing to engage in, to Representative Moody's point?
So when we look at Colorado's red flag law, I generally support that when we have due process attached to it. And that becomes important, right? Sometimes we have these red flag laws where there is no availability to due process. And so again, when we talk about law enforcement, my job is to uphold everyone's. Did you say you can't hear me?
Yeah, which state? Colorado.
Colorado. It's very limited. Now, the agencies work on that themselves, right? So with my agency, if there was an ERPO or we had information pertaining to this, we wouldn't just act on the ERPO. We would actually get a warrant that now we're into the due process where someone has a little bit, we have to take that extra step. And that's what we would do voluntarily at our agency. And there's a lot of agencies in the state of Colorado that take that additional step. All right? And so that is to protect both sides. Red flag laws can be extremely contentious, but I am in favor if we have that extra step to say, we're going to get a warrant to move forward with it. So we're just not on, this conversation that takes place of a petition to a judge. We're not just going to go into someone's home and seize their property without a warrant, okay? And so that's that extra step that I talk about. I'm very much in favor when we talk about steps to stop these. When someone is in crisis, we need to have a step there to be in front of them and understand, hey, we know that this is going on and we are taking the right steps, all right? I don't like when people say there's guarantees. That we do this, it's a guarantee. I've been a cop for 30 years, right? We can enact all kinds of laws. In fact, we have laws against homicide, and we still have them, right? So I don't like when we talk in guarantees. I am in favor of safe storage. You look at Colorado, Denver itself has the highest rate of motor vehicle theft. People leave their guns in their cars, and now we've got someone that stole a car, and that gun is now out in the community, right? Within your home, myself personally, of course, safe storage makes sense. It becomes harder when you get mandates to tell you what you're going to do in your own home by the government. And so I can see where there's resistance to that. So is there a way to move forward with that that is a little more palatable to where we're not now telling you in your own home what you are going to do, ruled by some mandate or something that comes from the government? But Colorado does have a safe storage law. The question that she's bringing up with me, and this is one that I struggle with over and over and over again, is the age. And, you know, give me a little grace on this, okay? But if we can send an 18-year-old overseas to fight our wars, to defend this country, and then we bring them back here and say, oh, no, thanks for what you did there, but we're not going to let you protect yourself here. That's a little problematic in my world. In my world, okay? So just give me grace on that. This meeting this coming together is to have these conversations, right? And to be able to find ways to move forward and figure things out. So do you raise the age going to the military? I don't know. But for me, that's a hard thing to say, listen, ma'am, woman, go overseas, fight our battles, but when you come back, oh no, thanks for your service, but you're not allowed to be able to defend yourself, all right? So these become hot. Let me throw this out here, and then I'll pass it on because I don't want to go too long. This is my personal experience. In 30 years being a cop, being at Columbine, being my second school shooting, Platte Canyon High School in 2006, my third school shooting in 2007 at Youth with a Mission, being a SWAT team leader, 16 years of my career. This is my experience in moving out of that, traveling the world, speaking to individuals. When we have one of these critical incidents that take place, and the first thing we do is scream gun control, and the first thing we do is scream mental health, scream these hot button topics, it divides this room in half, and we cannot find common ground. As we go through this panel, we're going to get to a point where we can start to talk about maybe some grassroots efforts that each community is a little bit different. What Denver needs is different than Austin, is different than Uvalde, is different than Oklahoma City, right? Grassroots efforts that we can do locally where we don't have to divide the community, but we can actually stop these. We've stopped 29 in the state of Colorado from happening, not by gun control, by getting the communities involved through programs like Safe Detect, Safe to Tell, and then having the infrastructure that when that person is identified, we get in front of them and we take it serious and we move forward. Not violating First Amendment rights, because I can say all kinds of crazy things, right? But getting into the root problem and moving forward. So the gun control thing is a topic that already I see people scowling and I see people clapping. It divides this room. If we can walk away from that and let's start talking about the root causes and come together as a community and find out what is right for our community and move forward together without dividing us apart, that's how we start to solve these things. And I've seen successes across the world, literally, when we get to that level. So I think you have a follow-up question for me, or are you moving on?
I'm going to move to Jesse for a second. Jesse, Raise the Age obviously got a lot of movement, grassroots movement in Uvalde. Didn't happen last session, but what is the feelings about that there in that community? It is a pretty gun-friendly community in many ways. Oasis, where the gunman bought his gun, is literally in the middle of the store, in the middle of the city. We were talking about that last night. It's also a restaurant. Just what are the thoughts around that issue, you think, in your community?
Well, it seems a lot of things are reactive instead of proactive begin with, but the conversation, it's a tough conversation. And the moment that we start using words like ban, like the gentleman said, these certain hot words, right? It kind of, you get a little pushback on that. As far as like the raising the age, in talking just to different people that own ranches, that hunting ranches, all types of people, everybody in that town pretty much was in favor of raising the age. Just in communication with them, we thought we had a chance with it. We got a lot of support from Mr. King, Mr. Moody, and a lot of other people, but unfortunately, it just didn't pass. And we're hopeful that in the future that something like that would happen. In this case, our Jackie would have been here. It would have allowed him to go through a period of time. I call it a cooling down period. This monster, this individual that had so much anger that was going to carry such a ugly massacre out there. It would have perhaps allowed him to do that, because we were all children at once, angry, happy, whatever the case may be. And so, you need that period of time, and in this case, it would have saved him. And I try to err on the side of caution, and if when you go to the military, as AJ said, you go to the military, but they don't just hand you a weapon and tell you, here you go. They do the training, they psychological, they teach you these things. So when you come back and you want to buy something, then you've been through those tests, through those methods that are going to allow you to buy a weapon of mass destruction, And so in this case, 19 people, 19 children that had potential, 2 teachers that loved what they did, and the husband that died of a heart attack, they still be with us today. So,
For clarity, the bill that was drafted this session was a very constructive conversation. It had an exception for those that have served in the military. We had those conversations to ferret that out. Let's talk about youth sports. A lot of youth that involved in shooting sports. And so Tracy was very intentional about saying, what are the exceptions we should have to this? And so there was a military exception built into it. There was a number. He tried to meet with anyone and everyone. I mean, Tracy King was someone that was A-rated by the Texas State Rifle Association, so it's not like he was foreign to the concerns. He sat down with all of them and said, okay, that's a good reason that someone this age should have access. Let's carve it out. And he met with everybody to do that. So we had very constructive conversations to build a bill that really zeroed in on a specific circumstance we were looking at, and any of those situations like military or others that were brought up, we wrote exceptions into the bill for. I think it was a very thoughtful conversation. Weren't able to move it forward than that, but it is possible to have those conversations around due process. I was in a 12-hour hearing about due process, and I think people will confuse it. What they mean is there sufficient due process? There's always some level of due process. And so what is it in this case? There were some people that said even if you had a full jury trial, I don't think it's full due process enough to divest someone of their weapons. I said, okay, well, that's probably not a feasible thing to do because you're talking about emergency situations. But we have protective order laws that have sufficient due process in Texas that they're being signed every day in the state of Texas in every city. And part of those protective orders have weapons restrictions. That's today. And so we can have that conversation. That's due process that's in our law today. If we want to say whether it's sufficient or not, let's have that conversation. I do think that there are people, no one on this stage, there are people that are involved in this conversation that are not honest brokers in having that conversation. Their answer is always no, and they will throw out things like due process to essentially stymie the conversation and don't really want to drill down into what is sufficient due process. And I think it's really technical and legal, but as a prosecutor, a former prosecutor, and someone who's a defense attorney, I can wade into those things in the policy making. But those are the types of things that I think we can have those rather than divide up people and sit them on different sides. Let's sit down and talk to one another and have those conversations. I think you can have productive ones, but you got to get people that really want to be at that conversation table.
And if I can add real quick, I think one other thing, and I've heard this from all of my panelists or co-panelists, so I just kind of want to throw it out there, because I'm a female who studies male-perpetrated gun violence. I'm in a no-win situation in this conversation. But I think what I'm hearing from everybody and what I really try to advocate for is when we come to the table to have these conversations, we have to stop talking in absolutes, right? Because we hear it's gun control, which people hear, take away all the guns, 0 guns in America. That genie's not going back in the bottle. There's 400 million guns in circulation in this country. You're not putting them all away. And then gun rights, which other people then perceive to be everything for everybody, for all you want, here we go. And the reality is if we stop using, we talked about buzzwords earlier, right? If we stop saying gun control, gun rights, and we come to the table and say, okay, side A, do you believe that children should be able to go to school and come home? Yes? Okay, great, me too. Let's deal in gun violence prevention. And I think that would be a much more productive conversation.
So we've talked a little bit about guns and mental health here, and we have just a few more minutes, but I think the other part of this is the school safety and law enforcement training that I want to ask you three about. So real quick, AJ, we mentioned that, 25 years after Columbine, the law enforcement response at Uvalde was a failure, and in our reporting, we found that, in fact, 37 states require almost annual drills of teachers and students, but no state requires that every year of police. Texas now has the strongest law requiring 16 hours of active shooter training every 2 years, which was only passed after Uvalde. But why are we still in this situation with unregulated, not uniform active shooter training for law enforcement 25 years after Columbine?
The answer to that question would take us into the evening, so I will try to keep this a little more concise, right? I think there's a lot of factors that move in when we start to talk about law enforcement. We talk about budgets, we talk about manpower, we talk about the reality of, do we think it's going to happen here? And a lot of that is emulated from the executive leadership, the chief of that organization that directs people forward. It is insane to me that agencies are not doing regular active shooter training multiple times a year. Now, Texas came out and said 16 hours in 2 years. That is not enough. And these situations are so critical, so dynamic, things are happening so fast to say that I'm going to take you and I'm going to give you 8 hours of training this year, and then almost 11 months later the incident happens. We are not prepared. Always remember this. The best plans, the suspect has a say in how this thing's going to go. And we know that suspects train. We know that they plan. And so it's not just a black and white issue. Everything they're doing is in the gray. And so at my agency, we did active shooting 3 times a year. It rotated through from different type of stuff. I won't bore you with all of that. But I think it always falls back on the local government, the chief there. We have this pervasive attitude, it's not going to happen here. And then it doesn't happen, and so we get lax in what we're doing. And this is the community as well. We see the parallels with the community. Then we have an incident happen. We just had one in Georgia, right? Now everybody's, up and thinking, oh man, are we ready? And we try to prepare, but if you look across the country right now, staffing is at the lowest levels it's ever been in law enforcement. Active shooter training is hard. It's manpower intensive, right? And so what becomes important? And that's the chief's decision to say, I'm going to keep all my cops on the street to handle calls for service, or you know what, I've got to pull a shift off, and now we're going to do active shooter training. I would advocate for, let's pull them off, let's make sure that we're doing the training. States that come out and want to mandate training that are unfunded becomes extremely difficult as well. Because now you have an agency that has a set budget. We want realistic training. We want stimulus response, realistic training to create the synapse in the brain, the pathway, so that when this thing is happening, we can react appropriately under stress. To get that type of training, it takes money. And so when we have mandates that come out that are unfunded, that becomes even more difficult for these agencies.
So that's something the legislature could change, as it did in Texas.
That absolutely could change, yeah.
Real quick, then we'll go to questions. Jesse and Jacqueline. Jesse, you're on the school board. Jacqueline, you worked with Parkland developing school safety. Sorry,
I worked in a school district in New York.
In New York, I'm sorry. Yeah, you came from Parkland and learned from Parkland. But can you all just tell me a little bit about just quick takeaways on what we can do more to make schools safer and what Uvalde has done now.
I'll just knock that out first. We focused a lot on, our work was done in response to the Parkland shooting, and I worked in New York's 5th largest school district for about 5 years, really trying to understand the impact of lockdown drills because they get a really, really bad rap. Right, and that has a lot to do with the very sensorial drills where people are basically simulating active shooter events to teach kids how to prepare. And the reality is like we don't set schools on fire to practice a fire drill. We don't need to simulate an active shooter to practice a lockdown drill. It's the exact same thing, or to practice a lockdown. It's the exact same thing AJ just said for law enforcement, but civilian side. We're building muscle memory so that when you find yourself in a very stressful situation, your mind goes blank because it's going to. You're processing and you're 12 minutes behind what's going on in that moment. Your body's going to go on autopilot and do what it's trained to do. And so, I will summarize it to say we worked with 20,000 kids and about 4,300 employees collecting data on over 500 lockdown drills. I know way more about this than any person probably should. But what we found is that when you use trauma-informed best practices, you create a culture of preparedness, you create a culture of empowerment, and I will go so far as to throw myself on the sword, so to speak, and say, we are teaching people situational awareness and good decision-making in stressful situations, and that is not a skill that is only useful in the four walls of a school building. And I say that because 10 days before Jesse lost his niece, we had a shooting 2 hours from my house in Buffalo where a man walked into a supermarket and killed 10 patrons. And when that shooting started, there was an 8-year-old girl with her grandfather in that supermarket. Her grandfather, who graduated high school the year before Columbine and like me never went through a drill a day in his life. And when that shooting started, that 8-year-old knew what to do, and she knew how to get him out to safety. So if you think that it has utility only in school and that we're not preparing them with a life skill, I encourage you to reshape that thinking because we are teaching emergency response and preparedness, and that can be used anywhere.
Jacqueline, that is really grim, I have to say, but I take the point. Jesse, real quick, we have a lot of questions just on what Uvalde has done since.
At the school level, we hold each other accountable. We make sure that the superintendent has what she needs. We provide oversight, and we give her all the tools and resources that she's going to need. One of the things that...
And this is a new superintendent now.
Right, new superintendent, new board, so to speak, and new faces there. But we have to hold each other accountable, always be alert, always be aware, never let your guard down. If you think that it happened once, it happened once. If you think it's not going to happen again, there's a good chance that it may. So don't ever think that it's not going to come knocking on your front door because one day you may be faced with the same thing. So we're always at alert. And you have to work together with the other law enforcement entities, and you got to build that trust. One of the things that I wrestle with is you can go to training all day long, active shooter training, all types of training. You can have certifications, but the courage is the one that I wrestle with. Do they have the courage it takes to run in and put their life on the line for a child and an adult, especially a child, and that's have lived through that. We obviously know what happened that day, right? Arredondo didn't have the courage to turn the knob. These other individuals didn't have the courage to tell Arredondo, you're relieved of your duties. I will take over the command. And as a result, people suffered, people died, and you have survivors that continuously will always have this nightmare. And so we have to be alert, and we have to be proactive, not reactive. We have to look for ways to counter that and not just help our little town, but help any other town and any other, hopefully it'll never happen again. But as we know, just a few days ago in Georgia.
Thank you. We'll take the first question.
Thank you. Mr. DeAndrew, can you help me, please? Explain to me why you think civilians should be able to possess AK-47s and other weapons of war.
You want my personal opinion on that? Second
You're
Amendment.
The person of being,
Yeah.
the Second Amendment doesn't say that. It's an interpretation of the Second Amendment.
Well, the way I interpret the Second Amendment, it allows us to be able to have those weapons, yes.
So there's no restriction on the kind of weapons a
No,
civilian
there's all
should-
kinds of federal restrictions. You can't have automatic weapons. To get a suppressed weapon, you have to go through a process. We talk about the mental health thing, right? For me to go buy a firearm, there's a mental health question that I have to check, and if I check that inappropriately, I can't purchase the weapon. So there are stopgaps federally, but the Second Amendment is for me to allow myself to be able to protect myself, and for the federal government to regulate how I'm going to protect myself to a certain degree. I get it. I don't need an automatic weapon. I don't need some of these things. But where I live in Colorado, it's a 20-minute response for law enforcement to get there. And now you're going to tell me what weapon I need to be able to defend myself and my family? That becomes a little bit difficult for me. I understand your point, and these are questions that this democracy lets us work through and talk about. But my point is different than yours. But yeah, I do believe the Second Amendment says that we have access to those.
Thank you. Next question.
Yeah, I understand about where you live and your, response time, that kind of thing. This is all, we don't have time for all of that. This is happening now. And to say that an 18-year-old should be able to go buy a weapon like Salvador Ramos did, he had a background check, nothing. He got the weapon legally, completely legally. But is anyone, it's insane to think that a male, 18 years old, I think we know their brains are not fully formed yet, that they can go do that with no training at all. In the military, you have extensive training. They don't just hand a kid a weapon. They have extensive training. If you're going to say that anyone can buy a weapon, why not have training? Why not say, I can't drive a car without a license and training. I can't, shoot a bird in my pasture without getting a license. Why can't we say that a child of 18 can't buy a weapon of that magnitude that does that much damage on a whim and go use it and buy that many rounds of ammunition that doesn't set off a red flag for anyone? We're falling all over ourselves to arm the schools, to make the schools safe, this. But we're so gun crazy and pounding our chests on the Second Amendment. It was about a militia, by the way. That's what it was about. So I'm just
sorry.
venting.
The question is, again,
The
on race
question
age
is, why
and or
can't-
training for...
Why can't we have a law that, yes, you can buy it if you're 18, but you're going to have training, just like you used to have handgun training before you carried a concealed weapon?
Perhaps both AJ and Representative Moody, you can address the training aspect. Has this been proposed? And
Yeah, when we had when you had license to carry and other provisions, there's training that goes along with that. The trajectory in the Texas legislature is that we've continued to whittle that away, and are not requiring as much as we have in the past. I think the way to have this conversation is, I think everybody, if any responsible gun owner knows that they're going to go train. By the way, the attacker in this situation, the first time he fired a weapon was likely that day. And so, yes, there are things that you can put in place that can, like you say, can encourage responsible gun ownership, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. I think the way you do it matters, particularly in a place like Texas. So maybe let's incentivize it rather than mandate things. Are there ways that we can incentivize people to do safe storage rather than mandate it? Let's incentivize it. Let's, if we want to do certain types of training, we think that's good. Let's figure out ways to incentivize. And these are just part of the conversations we've had, because you hit a roadblock when you say, I'm going to mandate this, I'm going to mandate that. That doesn't go anywhere. That conversation is not really productive at the legislature. So, all right, let's talk about, if these are the places we want to get to for safe gun ownership, what are other ways we can do it? We have a good gun safety promotion tool that's been utilized. Donna Howard was a big proponent of that and has worked on it for years. So those are the types of things we can do. So in kind of furthering the conversation we had before is, let's find the space. We can all agree that as a safe gun owner, you probably know how to use it. You've trained. You're going to store it safely. Okay, mandates don't seem to be something that's palatable here. What are ways that we can still get there? And what role can we play to do that? And so I think that's the conversation we can foster.
next question.
Hi, my name's Jeremy. As one of those 18-year-olds sent to fight overseas, I want to note that active duty military cannot maintain private firearms in their own homes. When you are in the military, you must store them in the company arms room for your unit. You need your commander's permission to check it out. You have to interact with 2 different people, sign it out. You have to sign it back in within the agreed upon time frame. And if you commit a crime with that firearm, the commander and the arms room officer, they are held liable for having issued out that weapon. So the notion that when you come back, that somehow we'd be like more restrictive in rights isn't actually true. In the military, you are far more restricted. And the reason for that is it has national security implications to have weapons that are crafted by American manufacturers going missing and perhaps being used against us. And so I fought Al-Qaeda and ISIS overseas for about 9 years. And in their guides that they make for how to commit attacks in America, they list American laws and the laxity of them as a vulnerability to exploit. So it seems that there's a very clear national security element here that doesn't seem to ever make it into the conversation. We have blueprints and templates for how police officers and SWAT teams and military members are trained and have to use and enforce weapons in this way. And we have our opponents actively exploiting them, as we saw in San Bernardino and the Pulse nightclub shooting and a number of other cases. So my question is about why is the national security angle really not a major effect in this conversation? There are lots of public health and other elements that are commonly discussed, but there is actually a very direct correlation to issues that we see abroad.
I think this is for AJ and Representative Moody together.
Let me start with first, thank you for your service. Secondly, I threw the military example out there as a generality. Being in the military doesn't get you a pass with me. November 8th, 2018, borderline, ex-Marine, tried to kill my daughter as 12 people were killed as she made it into the attic and was texting me. I use that just as a broad example, though, right? And so if we want to start talking about national security issues, we got a lot of things that we need to talk about, right? Before we, I mean, that is one, sure. But there are others as well if we want to get into that realm as far as who's being allowed into this country, how are we checking, what are we doing, all of that type of stuff, right? Which might be something we might want to consider as well. And so it was as a broader example to say, you're 18, we're going to allow you to vote, we're going to send you overseas, we're going to grant you all these things. Now, as a community, if we come together and say, no, right? As is the legislature, and we come together as a community, myself as a law enforcement officer, I don't make the laws. If this is the law that you enact, that's the law that I'm going to enforce. And that's how you want your law enforcement officers to be. You don't want us to go out there interpreting things saying, well, I like this law, I'm going to enforce it, but I don't like that law, and I'm not going to enforce it, right? And so if as a community we come together and we change those things, every law that's been passed in Colorado that has to do with any type of gun restriction, I support it. I support it. Why? Because it was passed. Heck, we passed marijuana. Do I like that? No, but it's there. And so you support it because it was a law that's passed and we move forward, right? When we get in the words of absolutes, and I think that's what was said over here, when we get into these words of absolutes, it divides us and we can't talk at all. And so I think you bring up valid points that probably need to be discussed further. But as a community, we need to come together and, you know, the best words I heard here was gun violence prevention. Let's start there. It's not going to divide us, right? And there's other reasons, you know, with the military as well, especially when you're on U.S. soil and the Posse Comitatus Act and all those things that are in place so that the military cannot be used against its citizens. So that it's a broader thing why they lock those up, not just for the national security part, right? But these type of events allow us to start to have these conversations.
Is this ever part of the discussion in the legislature, national security implications with
I mean, I think where it really fits in the broader conversation is stranger sales. Like, so who are we selling to? I think that's really where it fits in. In fact, in the wake of El Paso and Midland, Odessa, right, there was a conversation, at least related to Midland, Odessa, someone that lied on the background check, right? There was no state-level offense for that. We then came back and actually passed the state-level offense for that because the feds weren't really prosecuting it. So let's give the state the opportunity to prosecute if they so choose to do. And then the conversation we had up in the governor's office with, I mean, lots of stakeholders, including Texas State Rifle Association and others, was, and I remember the governor putting this question to them: why is it okay that I don't know whether I'm selling a gun to a terrorist? Why is that okay that I don't know that I'm selling this gun to a criminal street gang member? Like, stranger sales are a problem. Are there ways that we can get after that? Are there ways that we can identify that? That, you know, background checks are very difficult conversations to have, but I think that's where it fits in this conversation. Stranger sales are the when you talk about exploiting lax laws, the stranger sales are where that happens. And so, are there ways that we can incentivize people to take those sales if they're doing private sales? Let's take those into a federally licensed firearm dealer and let them do the work there. Let's pay them to do that background check there and incentivize that. Let's get people to do those sales there. Again, mandates become very difficult, but let's have a positive conversation about what would we like this to look like. Well, we'd like to know who you're selling to, and let's figure out ways we can do that. And we've had that conversation, and I think we should continue to, because I think most people would say it's insane that you would be able to sell to a stranger without knowing what it is and who they are or what they're doing with it. Are there ways that we can better we can create a better structure around that don't infringe on people's rights? Right? There's a good balance. It's a good conversation to have.
Y'all, I'm so sorry, but I've been told we've run out of. If you one last question, very fast.
Okay, thank you, Lomi. So, thank you for putting together this panel, this conversation, which is necessary to have. And I'm the president of AMC and board president of Texas Doctors for Social Responsibility. So we are an advocacy organization putting together an event here in Austin on the 27th on prevention, and that's a key word. As physicians and medical professionals, we see this issue as a public health crisis that can be prevented. Safety, education, common sense legislation, just to mention two things. So again, we are inviting the people who are concerned about gun violence to please become active. And in that sense, I would like to thank Moms Demand Action, who is our partner in this issue, and other grassroots organizations. So if anybody's interested, I have flyers for that. And thank you again.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thanks for joining.